The airport was buzzing with energy. People hurried in every direction, dragging suitcases behind them, checking flight boards and talking on phones. The sounds of rolling wheels on the polished floor, announcements over the loudspeakers, and the chatter of families mixed with the distant hum of planes taking off created a rhythm that almost felt alive. Among the crowd, a man moved slowly, calmly, almost detached from the rush around him. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't look stressed or distracted. He seemed, in fact, oddly peaceful. But his eyes were alert, noticing every small detail, every little movement around him. He approached the check-in counter and handed over his ticket. The clerk, young and polite, scanned it quickly. Her face lit up with a smile. "Sir," she said, "we have a first-class upgrade available. You can sit in the front cabin. More space, better service. Would you like to take it?" Most people, she knew, would jump at the offer. First class meant comfort, luxury, a little break from the normal life of traveling. Most people would never refuse. She had seen it happen hundreds of times. But this man, the one standing quietly in front of her, did something unexpected. He shook his head. "No, thank you," he said calmly. "I'll stay in my assigned seat." The clerk blinked. "Are you sure?" she asked, surprised. She looked at his ticket again, making sure she hadn't read it wrong. "It's completely free," she added, trying one last time to convince him. He smiled faintly, but it wasn't a big smile. It was quiet, almost thoughtful. "Yes," he said again. "I'm sure." The clerk shrugged, a little confused, and handed back his boarding pass. He thanked her softly, as if nothing unusual had happened, and turned away. Passengers nearby couldn't help but notice. Whispers began to ripple through the line. Did he just refuse first class? One person murmured to another. A few heads turned, curiosity showing in their eyes. Some were surprised, some impressed, and some didn't care at all. As he walked toward the gate, his movements were steady, unhurried, almost like he was observing everything and everyone at the same time. People moved around him quickly, bumping into one another, dragging luggage, calling out to each other, and he passed through it all, quiet and composed. It was strange to see someone in such a rush, yet so calm in the middle of chaos. He walked past first-class passengers entering their cabin, past flight attendants giving polite greetings, and past families scrambling to find their seats. When he finally reached his assigned seat in the economy section, he placed his bag carefully under the chair in front of him. He sat down, adjusted himself, and looked around the cabin. At first glance, it seemed like a normal flight. Passengers were settling in, some reading, some scrolling on their phones, some napping already. Flight attendants moved up and down the aisles, offering drinks, assisting people with bags, and giving instructions to ensure everyone was comfortable. But he didn't just look. He noticed details that most people ignored. The slight hesitation in the way one attendant spoke to a child traveling alone. The small impatience in another attendant's tone when a passenger asked for help. The uneven attention given to different travelers. Some treated with care, others almost ignored. He noticed a woman struggling to place her bag in the overhead compartment, and no one offered assistance until it was almost too late. He saw a man holding a baby, juggling luggage and trying to calm the child, and yet, the help that arrived was slow and distracted. He remained quiet, though. He didn't complain. He didn't intervene. He simply observed. He had done this before in other situations in other places. He understood that how people behave when they think no one important is watching reveals a lot. And he wanted to see the truth, not just a polished version. He wanted to see how the crew treated everyone equally when the pressure was on, when the spotlight was off, and when no one expected scrutiny. The flight began to board fully, and the cabin slowly filled with the sounds of conversations, rustling bags, and occasional laughter. Some people tried to make small talk with their neighbors. Some passengers complained quietly about their seats or requested assistance. The man noticed how patiently or impatiently the crew responded. He saw a young couple struggling to get two seats together, and how a flight attendant initially waved them off, only helping after repeated requests. At one point, An elderly woman tried to reach the call button for assistance with her blanket. The attendant passed by without noticing. She struggled for a moment before finally managing to signal for help. The man's gaze didn't leave the scene. He wasn't angry. He didn't even show surprise. He simply watched. As the plane doors closed, the routine of the cabin began. Flight attendants began their safety announcements, but even in this structured procedure, he noticed things others didn't. The clarity in one attendant's instructions, the nervousness in another's voice, the casual movements of some and the rigid posture of others. Every small detail told a story. Every small action revealed character. For 30 minutes, he continued to observe quietly. The first-class section, with its quiet and calm environment, its padded seats and attentive staff, existed at the front of the plane. Luxury and comfort seemed guaranteed there. But he had chosen economy for a reason. Here, in the real cabin, with real passengers, real struggles and real human interactions, he could see what mattered most. He could see the truth. He watched a young man trip over a bag in the aisle and almost fall. The attendant passing by gave a distracted glance but didn't stop. The man noticed how people reacted around him, how some helped instinctively, others stayed silent. It was all part of the same observation. Not just what the crew was doing, but how passengers were responding, too. A mother traveling with 2 children tried to calm them while retrieving snacks from her bag. The children were fidgety, whining, and restless. She asked politely for help from the nearby flight attendant, but the response was slow and impatient. She managed on her own, but the man's eyes followed every movement, noting the subtle frustration on the mother's face and the slight embarrassment she tried to hide. He noticed patterns. Noticing patterns was part of his nature. He saw which attendants treated each passenger as an individual and which treated everyone as a task to complete. He noticed how small gestures, offering a smile, helping with a bag, listening patiently, made a difference. And he noticed how the lack of those gestures caused quiet disappointment, frustration, or discomfort for passengers who deserved better. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't make his presence known. Most people around him still had no idea who he was. He didn't need recognition. The observation itself was enough. He wanted to understand the truth of how the crew performed, how the passengers experienced their flight, and how small human decisions shaped the journey for everyone. The plane reached cruising altitude, and the attendants began serving drinks and snacks. Some passengers received attention quickly, others waited longer. He noticed it all. He noticed how some passengers smiled politely even when service was slow, how others grew impatient quietly, and how a few became frustrated and vocal. The reactions were small, human, and telling. The man leaned back in his seat. He wasn't uncomfortable, not really. He had enough room and he didn't need extra luxuries. The decision to refuse first class was intentional. It wasn't about showing humility or testing anyone. It was about seeing what others often ignored. It was about observing human behavior in a setting where pressure, routine, and personality intersected. He observed the flight attendants, noting who was kind and who was indifferent. He watched the passengers, noting who helped others and who stayed silent. And slowly he began to see the bigger picture. Patterns of care and neglect emerged. Small moments revealed the character of the people around him, moments that would otherwise go unnoticed if everyone had stayed in their own bubble of comfort. As the minutes passed, the quiet realization began to form in his mind. This flight was more than just a routine journey from one city to another. It was a story of human interaction, of choices made, of empathy exercised or withheld. And in the coming minutes, the real test would begin. The cabin settled into a rhythm, but the man's eyes didn't leave the people around him. He wasn't looking for mistakes. He wasn't judging. He was observing, watching the small actions that revealed the truth. And as the plane continued its journey, he knew that what he had seen so far was only the beginning. Everything in that economy cabin mattered. Every gesture, every decision, every interaction. And he had refused luxury for one simple reason: to see it clearly, to experience the truth, and to witness the human side of a journey that most people ignored. He leaned slightly forward, resting his hands on his lap, and let the story unfold before him. The flight was just beginning, but already, it was a lesson in patience, observation, and understanding. And in the next 30 minutes, everything he had quietly watched would lead to a moment no one on the plane would forget. Because sometimes the simplest choice, refusing comfort, sitting among ordinary people and watching closely, can reveal truths that no luxury seat ever could. And in that moment, he knew one thing clearly. The next chapter of this flight was about to change everything. The plane had leveled off at cruising altitude, and the hum of the engines filled the cabin with a steady rhythm. Most passengers settled into their routines, some reading, some scrolling on their phones, others staring out of the windows at the clouds drifting below. The atmosphere seemed calm at first glance, but the man in seat 18A noticed the subtle differences in the way each person was treated. It started small, almost unnoticeable to anyone not paying close attention. A flight attendant walking down the aisle offered a drink to a passenger who smiled politely and thanked her. But when another passenger tried to get the same attention, the response was slower, less warm, almost dismissive. The man saw it all, quietly noting every movement, every gesture, every small interaction. A mother sat across the aisle, trying to calm her restless child. The little boy was crying softly, tugging at her sleeve, asking for something to drink. She pressed the call button, waiting patiently. After several minutes, a flight attendant finally approached, her expression slightly annoyed. She handed over a cup of juice without a word and moved on. The mother smiled politely, hiding her frustration, but the man could see it in her eyes. She was trying to maintain composure, but the fatigue and tension were clear. Nearby, an elderly man struggled to place his carry-on in the overhead bin. He was careful, but the bag was heavy, and it kept slipping from his grasp. A flight attendant passed by without noticing. Another passenger offered a helping hand, and the elderly man's face relaxed into a small smile. The man in seat 18A watched quietly, appreciating the kindness of the stranger, but also noticing how little the crew seemed to intervene when someone genuinely needed help. Even the small things mattered. He noticed how some passengers were treated like objects to manage, while others were treated with care and respect. The difference was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Some attendants smiled genuinely, some spoke politely, some seemed distracted, almost bored. The man didn't judge, he simply observed. Every small detail added to a larger picture he was forming in his mind. About 20 minutes into the flight, the mood in the cabin started to shift slightly. The initial excitement of travel had worn off, and people were beginning to notice minor inconveniences. A young woman with a laptop struggled to adjust her seat to reach the tray table. She asked politely for assistance, and the flight attendant helped, but the tone was rushed, almost impatient. Another passenger nearby asked for an extra blanket, and the response was slower, as if fulfilling a chore rather than helping a person. The man leaned back in his seat, not moving, not speaking, but fully alert. He could feel the tension in the cabin, subtle as it was. Some passengers tried to ignore the small discomforts, some whispered complaints to each other, and a few kept silent, watching the staff and hoping for assistance. The man noticed how each person responded differently to the same situation. Some were patient, some frustrated, some polite, and some resentful. Human behavior, he thought, was fascinating in its complexity. He watched a young father trying to calm his child while also managing his own bags. The child was crying softly, tugging at the father's shirt, demanding attention. The father's face showed exhaustion, but he smiled patiently. When a flight attendant passed by, she gave only a quick glance before moving on. The man's eyes followed her, noting the lack of empathy, the small disconnect between those serving and those being served. The father managed on his own, but the man could see the strain in the child's eyes and the subtle tension in the father's body. Then there was a couple arguing quietly over their seats. The woman wanted to switch, the man didn't. A flight attendant approached, and instead of helping calmly, she seemed frustrated, raising her voice slightly to assert authority. The man noted the tension, the discomfort, and the fear that sometimes comes from small confrontations that could have been handled with understanding. The man wasn't just noticing mistakes or imperfections. He was noticing patterns. The crew responded well in some situations, poorly in others. Some passengers were treated with care. Some were not. Some mistakes were corrected quickly. Some were ignored. It was a subtle map of human behavior, showing how people act under stress, how they prioritize, and how they perceive those around them. He noticed another small detail: the way passengers themselves reacted to the service. Some smiled politely, even when things were slow. Some complained quietly. Some made no reaction at all. And some helped each other without waiting for the crew. The man thought about how small gestures, whether from crew or passengers, made a difference in the experience. A smile, a helping hand, a patient word, it could change everything. 30 minutes into the flight, he noticed something that caught his attention more than anything else. A young mother traveling alone with 2 children asked for assistance with her bags. The children were restless and noisy, tugging at her sleeves, crying softly. The flight attendant looked at her, paused, then walked past without offering help. The mother took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, and managed on her own. The man observed her carefully. He could see the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, the effort it took to maintain composure, and the patience it demanded to keep the children quiet and comfortable. The way the crew responded or didn't respond revealed a lot to him. Not laziness necessarily, but a lack of attention, a lack of awareness, and a lack of empathy in some cases. He noted which staff members were attentive, which were distracted, which were compassionate, and which were indifferent. Every action, every reaction, every small decision mattered. And he recorded it quietly in his mind, understanding the full scope of human interaction unfolding in this enclosed space. He saw a small argument between 2 passengers over seat selection. The flight attendant intervened, but her tone was abrupt, almost irritated. The man noticed how quickly tension rose when authority was imposed without kindness. He saw fear and frustration spread among passengers in subtle ways. He understood, without needing to speak, how leadership or the lack of it could shape an environment. As the flight continued, he noticed more patterns. The older passengers often got overlooked when they asked for help. Young parents struggled quietly with children. Some passengers received prompt attention, others waited patiently, and some didn't get it at all. The man realized that small decisions, small gestures, could shape someone's experience dramatically. A smile, a patient word, a helping hand, a moment of understanding. These things mattered more than most people realized. He watched a young boy drop a small toy under a seat. His mother tried to reach it, but it was difficult. A flight attendant noticed but didn't pause, walking past to attend to other duties. The boy looked disappointed, the mother slightly embarrassed. The man's gaze followed every movement, noting the small disappointment that could have been avoided with a tiny act of care. And then, something happened that made him lean forward slightly. A passenger in the row ahead had a sudden issue. His tray table wouldn't lock properly. He called for help. The flight attendant responded but seemed annoyed. She fixed it quickly, but her frustration was visible. The man observed it all. He understood that it wasn't the technical issue that mattered, but the human response to it, the way people treat others when small problems arise. He realized that he had been watching for only 30 minutes, but in that short time, he had seen the full spectrum of human behavior in the cabin. Kindness and indifference, patience and frustration, understanding and neglect. Each action revealed character not just of the crew, but of the passengers as well. And then he noticed something subtle but important. A few passengers began to exchange glances, noticing the tension around them. A whispered word here, a small smile there. People were observing the reactions of others, feeling the atmosphere, sensing the subtle shifts in behavior. The man realized that environment shaped people as much as people shaped the environment. And he was watching it all unfold, quietly, attentively, without interfering. He thought about the choices each person made, the crew in how they acted, the passengers in how they reacted. Small decisions could make or break the comfort of others. Every gesture mattered. He understood that leadership and human kindness weren't about titles, wealth, or position. They were about choices made in the moment, how one treated those around them when no one was watching, and how one responded to challenges with patience and understanding. As the cabin settled into its rhythm, he leaned back, still observing. Some passengers were now quietly helping each other. A young woman offered her hand to someone struggling with a bag. A man comforted a child who had started crying. Small acts of care began to ripple through the cabin, unnoticed by most, but not by him. He saw the impact of empathy, and he saw the lack of it just as clearly. The man understood something important. The flight was not just about getting from one place to another. It was about human behavior, about interactions, about moments that might seem small but carried enormous weight. A single word, a gesture, or a choice could affect someone's entire experience. And in this cabin, he was seeing those choices play out, some good, some bad, and some indifferent. He wasn't angry. He wasn't critical. He was simply observing, understanding, and learning. The quiet moments of frustration, the subtle moments of care, and the unseen struggles of the passengers all painted a clear picture. And then, he noticed a few crew members whispering among themselves, glancing in his direction occasionally. Something about his quiet presence seemed to unsettle them slightly, not because of who he was, but because he wasn't acting like a typical passenger. He wasn't complaining. He wasn't seeking attention. He was simply observing. And that made some people uncomfortable because they knew someone was noticing, paying attention, recording each detail in his mind. The man leaned back again, watching the cabin, letting the interactions continue naturally. He knew the next moments would be important. He had observed enough to understand the patterns, the weaknesses, the strengths, and the small moments that made a big difference. And in the coming minutes, those observations would lead to something that no one on the plane could have expected. Because in the quiet of the economy cabin, amid ordinary passengers, small frustrations, and unnoticed acts of care, a story was unfolding. A story of human behavior, empathy, and responsibility. And the man in seat 18A was watching it all, fully present, fully attentive, and ready for what was about to happen next. He didn't yet speak. He didn't yet act. He simply observed. But the next moment would come soon, and it would change everything. The cabin had settled into its usual rhythm, yet the man in seat 18A remained fully alert. His eyes didn't wander aimlessly. They scanned every detail, every action, every expression. For over an hour, he had observed the subtle ways people acted when no one was paying attention. The flight attendants moved through their duties efficiently, but he could sense tension beneath the surface. Some were kind and attentive, while others operated mechanically, their gestures precise but distant. A small incident caught his attention. A young child had dropped a crayon under the seat in front of him, and the mother was struggling to retrieve it. She asked politely for help from the nearest flight attendant. The attendant glanced quickly, shrugged, and walked away. The child began to whimper, and the mother tried to calm him, frowning with a mix of frustration and embarrassment. The man observed quietly. He didn't interfere, but he saw every expression. The small crease on the mother's forehead, the child's hopeful gaze, the fleeting glance of disappointment in their eyes. He noticed other passengers helping without being asked. A teenager offered a blanket to a shivering passenger. A man with a baby in his lap helped an elderly woman place her bag in the overhead bin. These small acts of kindness did not go unnoticed by him. He recorded them silently, appreciating the humanity in these simple gestures, while also noting how rare they seemed in the larger flow of the cabin. About 30 minutes into this phase of observation, he noticed a subtle pattern forming. Certain flight attendants gave more attention to passengers who seemed polite or assertive, while others who appeared quieter or hesitant often went unnoticed. The man's brow furrowed slightly, not in anger, but in thought. Human behavior was fascinating, but it was also revealing. Those who were in positions of authority often failed to recognize the struggles of those who didn't demand attention. And yet, sometimes, one small act of empathy could ripple through the cabin, creating a sense of relief and calm. At one point, an elderly man sitting a few rows ahead struggled to open a water bottle. His hands shook slightly, and his face reflected quiet frustration. The nearest flight attendant passed by without a glance. The man leaned forward slightly, observing the interaction, noting how power and attention worked in subtle ways. The elderly man eventually managed on his own, sighing quietly, his face pale with discomfort. It was a small moment, almost invisible to most passengers, but the man in seat 18A saw it clearly. He reflected on his decision to remain in economy class. Sitting in first class would have shielded him from these small moments, from the unnoticed struggles, from the genuine human interactions that revealed character. Luxury could offer comfort, but it couldn't offer truth. That truth existed here, among the passengers who relied on the care and attentiveness of others, and among the crew whose actions affected everyone on the flight. Another moment caught his attention. A woman traveling alone struggled with her carry-on bag. She lifted it once, then again, but it slipped slightly each time. A flight attendant noticed but seemed impatient, gesturing her to try harder and moving on without offering assistance. The woman finally managed to wedge it into place, panting softly. The man's eyes lingered on her face, the mix of relief and frustration that came from having to solve a problem on one's own. He thought about how small actions or inactions could weigh heavily on someone's experience. Passengers around him began to notice subtle discomforts too. Whispered comments, small sighs, and occasional frowns spread quietly through the cabin. Most didn't speak loudly. They didn't want to create trouble. But the quiet dissatisfaction was noticeable to someone paying attention. The man observed it all, understanding that tension builds gradually, like a slow wave rising in silence. One small incident could push it to the surface. He saw a father trying to calm a crying child while balancing a laptop and a bag on his lap. His hands trembled slightly from exhaustion. A flight attendant passed by, offering only a quick glance. The father managed on his own, sighing quietly, but the strain in his posture revealed everything. The man in seat 18 and noticed the delicate balance between patience and frustration, between care and neglect, in the way humans interact in confined spaces. The flight continued, and small moments accumulated, each one adding weight to the atmosphere. A young couple argued softly about seat selection. A flight attendant intervened, but instead of calm reassurance, her voice carried a hint of irritation. The couple quieted immediately, sensing the authority but also feeling the tension. The man watched silently, noting how people respond when leadership is delivered without empathy. The man's attention shifted to the passengers themselves. He saw which individuals helped quietly, without expectation of recognition, and which withdrew into their own discomforts. One woman offered her hand to someone struggling to store a bag. A man with a restless toddler adjusted his seat to make space for a neighbor. These small, unspoken acts of kindness were often invisible to most, but they stood out sharply to him. He recognized that true human character is revealed in these moments, in choices made without an audience, without applause, without reward. About 45 minutes into the flight, a subtle tension began to rise in the cabin. Not enough to alarm anyone, but enough for those watching to feel it. A few passengers whispered to each other about slow service, minor inconveniences, or inattentive crew members. The man observed the way small frustrations affected behavior. Some people became quieter, withdrawing inward. Others became restless, fidgeting, or showing subtle signs of irritation. The ripple effect of human interaction was clear, and he saw it unfold like a careful study in motion. He noticed a few crew members glancing in his direction occasionally. Something about his calm demeanor, the way he sat quietly, seemed to unsettle them slightly. They weren't sure why, but there was a subtle tension in their movements. They continued their duties, but his presence created awareness. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't judgment, it was simply observation. And observation, he knew, has a way of making people conscious of themselves. Then a small crisis unfolded. A man a few rows ahead had a tray table that wouldn't lock properly. He called for help. A flight attendant responded, but her tone was sharp, almost impatient. The issue was fixed quickly, but the frustration was visible on both sides. The man in seat 18A leaned slightly forward, taking note of every expression, every subtle sign of tension. It wasn't the technical problem that mattered. It was the human response to it, the patience or lack thereof, the empathy or indifference. Another moment followed. A child spilled a drink on the floor. The mother tried to clean it up while the child cried softly. The nearest flight attendant handed her some napkins without offering further help. The mother smiled politely, hiding her frustration, and continued cleaning. The man watched quietly. Small actions like these revealed so much about human behavior. The way people handle minor discomforts, the way they respond to small frustrations, often speaks louder than grand gestures. As the flight continued, he began to see patterns more clearly. Some crew members were genuinely attentive and kind, while others were distracted or indifferent. Some passengers were considerate, helping those around them, while others focused only on themselves. Each interaction, each choice, created a ripple, affecting everyone nearby. The cabin was like a small ecosystem of behavior, and he observed it with quiet fascination. He noticed a young woman trying to adjust her seat while managing a laptop and a bag. She called politely for help. The attendant passed by without stopping. The man in seat 18A observed how the situation unfolded, noting the frustration that crept onto the woman's face and the subtle discomfort in the posture of nearby passengers. Small moments, he thought, can shape the entire experience of a journey, and yet they often go unnoticed. A few minutes later, another incident occurred. An elderly man struggled to reach his bag in the overhead bin. The nearest attendant glanced at him but continued walking. The man managed on his own, sighing quietly. Observing quietly, seat 18A could see the difference between someone who offers care and someone who ignores the need for it. He reflected on how often people in positions of authority forget the small, human moments that define the experience of others. By now, the man had been observing quietly for nearly an hour. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't drawn attention to himself. Yet, the effect of his presence was subtle but real. Crew members glanced at him occasionally, uncertain why he seemed so alert, so calm, so attentive. He wasn't there to criticize. He was there to understand. He wasn't there to demand respect. He was there to notice truth. The cabin had become a quiet theater of human behavior. Some moments were kind, some indifferent, some tense, and some unnoticed entirely. The man watched it all unfold, understanding that the truth of a situation often lies not in grand gestures, but in the small, everyday actions that most people overlook. He noticed how passengers adapted to the environment. Some quietly helped each other. A teenager offered her seatbelt extender to someone struggling. A man with a restless toddler moved to make space for a neighbor. The smallest gestures often had the largest impact. And he saw clearly how human empathy, patience, and attentiveness shaped the experience of everyone in the cabin. As the minutes passed, he realized something important. The flight wasn't just a journey from one place to another. It was a living story of human interaction, of choices made in real time, of moments that could uplift or frustrate, of behaviors that reflected character. Sitting quietly in economy, he was witnessing life in its raw, unpolished form. And he knew that soon, the observations he had made would lead to something that no one on this plane would forget. The man leaned back, still observing. Every sigh, every frown, every smile, every small act of kindness or neglect mattered. Every choice mattered. Every person mattered. And he understood something profoundly simple. The truth of human behavior is never found in comfort or luxury. It is found in the quiet, ordinary moments that test patience, reveal empathy, and show who people truly are. He didn't speak. He didn't act yet. He was watching, waiting, absorbing. And in the quiet of the economy cabin, amid ordinary passengers and unnoticed struggles, the stage was set. Soon, a moment would come that would bring all of these observations into focus, a moment that would change the atmosphere of the entire flight. Because sometimes the simplest act, sitting quietly, refusing comfort and watching carefully, reveals more than 1,000 words or actions ever could. and the moment that would reveal everything was approaching, quietly, inevitably, and with the weight of truth. The plane continued to glide through the sky, steady and quiet, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. The man in seat 18A had been observing for more than an hour, noting every small interaction, every subtle gesture, and every quiet struggle. The cabin was full of ordinary passengers, each carrying their own stories, each responding differently to the people around them. He had seen kindness, impatience, neglect, and small moments of care that often went unnoticed. But now he knew it was time to act. He pressed the call button. It was a simple gesture, but in the quiet economy cabin, it carried weight. A flight attendant appeared moments later, her expression polite but slightly distracted. "Yes, sir?" she asked, not yet understanding the significance of the request. He looked at her calmly, his voice soft but firm. "Could I please speak with the cabin manager?" The attendant's eyebrows rose slightly. A cabin manager wasn't usually called for minor requests from economy passengers. She hesitated, then nodded and walked away to fetch the manager. The man remained in his seat, quiet, composed, yet fully alert. He had watched enough to understand the patterns and was now ready to address them directly. A few minutes later, the cabin manager approached. She was professional, confident, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone used to solving problems in the air. She looked at him politely, expecting a routine question. But when she met his eyes, she felt an unusual calm intensity, a quiet authority that was not based on title but on presence. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. "I'd like to share some observations about the cabin today." The manager nodded. She expected minor complaints or questions about service. She did not expect what followed. He began carefully, describing the moments he had witnessed over the past hour. A young child dropped a crayon and waited without help. A mother traveling alone struggled with her carry-on. An elderly man could not reach his bag without assistance, and some requests from passengers were ignored or delayed. He did not speak with anger or accusation. He spoke quietly, clearly, calmly, detailing what he had observed and how it affected the passengers. The cabin manager listened, her expression shifting subtly as he described each situation. Some of the moments were minor, almost invisible to others, but she could see the pattern he was highlighting. There were gaps in attentiveness, small signs of impatience, and moments where empathy was missing. She began to understand that this was not about one incident. It was about behavior, responsibility, and care. He paused briefly, then continued. "I am not here to criticize individuals," he said. "I am here to point out that every passenger deserves attention and respect. Every small interaction matters. A smile, a helping hand, patience. All of these shape the experience of everyone on this flight." The manager's eyes met his. There was a moment of silent recognition, an understanding that this was more than a casual observation. The calm, composed man sitting in economy class was not just another traveler. He was someone who had seen enough to know the truth. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. It was simple, professional, and unassuming. When he handed it to her, the expression on her face changed instantly. Respect replaced uncertainty. Recognition replaced doubt. She now understood who she was speaking to and why his words carried weight beyond a typical passenger's complaint. He continued, his voice steady, his tone quiet but firm. "I have observed how the cabin operates. I have seen where attention is given and where it is lacking. I want to ensure that every passenger, regardless of where they are seated, receives the care they deserve." The cabin manager took a deep breath. She nodded, clearly taking in every word. There was no argument, no defensive response. The observations were factual, precise, and delivered without blame. She could not deny the truth of what he had seen. As he spoke, the flight attendants working nearby began to notice the change in tone. They glanced toward him, sensing the seriousness of the moment. Something about his quiet authority made the small mistakes and moments of neglect feel more significant. It was not fear that drove the change. It was awareness, understanding, and the weight of truth. He continued, describing specific examples with care. He spoke about the mother with restless children, the elderly man who struggled with his bag, the child whose toy had fallen, and the passenger whose tray table did not lock. Each story was simple, ordinary, yet profound in its impact. He illustrated how small acts of kindness or indifference could ripple through the cabin, affecting everyone around. The cabin manager listened, taking notes silently. She began to understand not only the issues but also the solution: awareness and accountability. She realized that even small adjustments in attentiveness could transform the experience for every passenger. After a few minutes, he leaned back slightly, still calm, still composed. He had said enough. The cabin manager nodded again, now fully aware of the observations, and said quietly, "Thank you. I understand." He did not raise his voice. He did not demand immediate action. His presence and words were enough to shift the atmosphere. The flight attendants, previously distracted or indifferent, now moved with a renewed sense of awareness. They adjusted their approach, ensuring that passengers who had been struggling received attention. Small acts of kindness began to ripple through the cabin. The young mother received help with her carry-on. The child's fallen toy was retrieved promptly. The elderly man was assisted with his bag. The father with the crying toddler was offered support. Each small intervention created a subtle shift in the atmosphere, and the passengers noticed. Some smiled quietly, others relaxed, and a few whispered gratitude to those helping them. The man observed all of it, satisfied but still quiet. He knew that change began with awareness, not confrontation. By quietly showing the truth and allowing the cabin crew to respond, he had initiated a subtle transformation. The difference was already noticeable, not dramatic, but real. He watched how people responded to the new attentiveness. Passengers seemed calmer, more comfortable. There were fewer sighs, less restless movement, and a quieter sense of cooperation in the cabin. The small gestures of care that had been lacking earlier now created a ripple effect. A simple smile, a helping hand, and a patient word had changed the environment. He also noticed the crew's subtle response. Some flight attendants exchanged glances, a silent acknowledgement of what had changed. There was no resentment, only understanding. They realized that the observations were not personal attacks but a call to recognize the importance of their actions. Each gesture, each choice mattered. The man reflected on what he had done. He had refused first class for a reason. Luxury would have insulated him from the realities of human behavior. By sitting among ordinary passengers, he had seen the struggles, the small injustices, and the missed opportunities for kindness. He had observed patterns that might have gone unnoticed in a more comfortable environment. And now, by quietly speaking the truth, he had shifted the experience of everyone on the plane. He leaned back in his seat, relaxed but attentive. He noticed the subtle improvement in the cabin, the calmer expressions of passengers, the renewed focus of the crew, and the small acts of kindness being offered more freely. He knew that change did not require force, but awareness. The simple act of observing, understanding, and speaking thoughtfully could have a profound impact. The next few minutes were quiet but meaningful. A young woman offered her assistance to a passenger struggling with her seatbelt. A man helped adjust a child's tray table. The mother with restless children received additional attention without asking. These small interventions, inspired by awareness and empathy, rippled quietly through the cabin. The man noticed the passengers' reactions. Some looked relieved, some smiled quietly, and some simply relaxed. He observed how the atmosphere had shifted from one of subtle tension to one of calm attentiveness. Small changes in behavior had transformed the experience. He realized that leadership, true leadership, was not about titles, wealth, or authority. It was about presence, observation, awareness, and the courage to speak the truth calmly and clearly. Small gestures, small words, and small acts of attention could create meaningful change. He also observed the crew. They were now more focused, more attentive, and more aware of each passenger's needs. They moved with a quiet purpose, ensuring that no one was left struggling. Their actions were not forced. They were natural responses to understanding the impact of their behavior. The man in seat 18A had quietly orchestrated a transformation. Without confrontation, without raising his voice, he had created awareness, inspired empathy, and encouraged attentiveness. The cabin, once routine and indifferent, had shifted to a space where human behavior mattered, where small gestures had real significance, and where passengers felt genuinely cared for. As the flight continued, he reflected on the lessons of the past hour. Observation, patience, and understanding had led to change. The small, unnoticed moments he had recorded and addressed had rippled through the cabin, creating a more positive environment. He realized that true impact is often quiet, subtle, and profound, rather than loud and dramatic. The passengers, now receiving better attention, seemed unaware of the orchestration behind it. They smiled, relaxed, and quietly appreciated the small acts of care around them. The crew, aware of their improved attentiveness, responded with subtle pride and confidence. And the man in seat 18A, calm and composed, continued to watch, fully aware that small gestures, clear observations, and quiet authority could change the course of human behavior. He understood that the next phase of the flight would build on this transformation. Awareness had been created, attentiveness had increased, and the stage was now set for a deeper understanding, a moment of recognition, and a conclusion that would leave a lasting impression on everyone present. Sitting quietly, he knew that leadership is often invisible, yet unmistakable. It is not demonstrated with force or ego, but with awareness, calm presence, and thoughtful action. He had turned observation into influence, empathy into action, and small acts of kindness into a ripple that would be felt by everyone on the plane. And in the quiet of the economy cabin, amid ordinary passengers and unnoticed struggles, a moment was approaching. A moment where the truth of human behavior, responsibility, and care would be undeniable. A moment where the choices made by individuals would no longer be subtle or unnoticed, but clear, visible, and meaningful. The man in seat 18A leaned back, calm, confident, and ready. The change he had begun would now reach its peak. And in a few minutes, the ordinary flight would reveal something extraordinary. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted subtly but undeniably. What had been quiet tension, small frustrations, and overlooked needs was now replaced with awareness, attentiveness, and small gestures of care that rippled through every row. Passengers seemed calmer. Children who had been restless were now quiet, assisted by attentive hands. Elderly travelers moved with ease, and mothers with young children received support without needing to ask repeatedly. The man in seat 18A watched it all, noting the change he had quietly inspired. He had chosen to sit in economy for a reason. Luxury, comfort, and separation would have shielded him from the reality of human interaction, from observing the small struggles, the missed opportunities for kindness, and the ways ordinary people navigate challenges. But by placing himself among them, he had become part of the ecosystem, a quiet observer, a catalyst for awareness and now for change. Several minutes passed, and the small improvements continued. A flight attendant offered a blanket to a shivering passenger without being asked. Another helped a young woman reach her bag in the overhead bin. Even passengers who had been frustrated before began to notice the difference. Small smiles appeared, quiet gestures of gratitude followed, and the cabin became a place where attention, care, and respect mattered. Then, the moment arrived that would bring everything to a clear turning point. A passenger several rows back began to struggle visibly. His tray table had become jammed, and he attempted to adjust it repeatedly without success. He pressed the call button, and the nearest flight attendant approached, but something in her demeanor had changed. Her voice, once rushed or impatient, was now calm and deliberate. She listened carefully, assessed the situation, and acted efficiently, making sure the passenger understood each step of the process. The man in seat 18A leaned slightly forward, observing the transformation in real time. It was small, almost invisible to anyone not paying attention, but it mattered enormously. This one incident reflected the ripple effect of awareness he had initiated. The cabin crew were no longer simply performing tasks. They were responding with thoughtfulness, empathy, and attentiveness. Passengers could feel it, even if they did not consciously realize why. The man then noticed something else, a subtle, almost imperceptible nervousness among some crew members. Their glances were quick, their steps slightly measured. They had realized that someone was observing more than just minor service complaints. Someone had been watching the cumulative impact of every small choice, every ignored request, every lapse in attention. And that person was not ordinary. He waited quietly, letting the moment build. The next action he would take would not be a complaint or a request. It would be a statement, a demonstration of accountability and standards. He did not raise his voice. He did not create drama. His calm, composed presence was all the authority he needed. When the cabin manager returned from walking the aisle to check on her crew, he spoke again, quietly but firmly. I have observed how the cabin functions, and I have seen how attention or lack of it affects passengers. There are moments where care is given, and moments where it is withheld. I believe in accountability, and I believe that everyone here should understand the impact of their actions. The manager nodded, sensing the seriousness in his words. There was no argument, no questioning. She could feel the weight behind them. He continued, looking around the cabin, his gaze calm but unwavering. Every person on this flight deserves care and respect, regardless of where they are seated or how busy the day has been. Leadership is not about authority or titles. It is about presence, awareness, and action when needed. And today, I expect the same standards for every passenger, every moment, and every interaction. The crew exchanged glances. They now understood fully that this was not a complaint about one isolated incident, but an expectation of consistent, professional behavior. The man's calm authority left no room for excuses. Every small lapse had been noted. Every action had been observed. And now, accountability would be enforced. He didn't shout, he didn't make threats, and he didn't demand drama. But with a quiet nod, he made it clear. Standards matter, and those who fail to meet them must face consequences. The cabin manager turned to her team, her voice steady. We have been observed. We need to ensure that every passenger receives the care they deserve, every moment of this flight. And then, something remarkable happened. The manager, understanding the gravity of the situation, called a private discussion with the crew in the galley. For the next few minutes, the cabin was unusually quiet. Passengers noticed only that the crew seemed more attentive, more focused, more deliberate in every gesture. The difference was subtle but unmistakable. When the crew returned to their posts, their behavior had changed. Every action was deliberate. Requests were answered promptly, with patience and attention. Smiles were genuine. Assistance was offered proactively. The entire environment shifted. Passengers began to relax visibly, noticing without knowing why that service had improved dramatically. It was in these moments that the man's quiet influence became undeniable. He had refused first class not to make a statement of privilege, but to experience reality, to observe human behavior, and to create awareness. By doing so, he had initiated a transformation. And now the results were clear. A young mother smiled quietly as a flight attendant helped her with her bags. An elderly man thanked a crew member for assistance he had not even requested. Children laughed softly, and passengers whispered small words of gratitude. The cabin had become a place where care and attentiveness were visible, felt, and appreciated. The man observed everything, fully aware that his presence had created change without confrontation or force. The lesson was clear: awareness, calm authority, and the courage to speak the truth quietly can inspire meaningful action. Leadership is not about making noise. It is about presence, empathy, and influence. Then the most profound moment came. The cabin manager approached him quietly, her expression respectful but serious. I want you to know that your observations have changed the way this cabin operates. The crew understands the importance of their actions now, and I will ensure that these standards continue. He nodded, satisfied but still calm. Thank you, he said softly. That is all I ask. The remaining flight passed without incident. Passengers moved comfortably, attended to their needs with minimal frustration, and interacted with the crew in a way that reflected mutual respect. Small gestures continued to ripple quietly through the cabin. By the time the plane began its descent, the atmosphere had shifted completely from what it had been just an hour earlier. The subtle tension, the overlooked needs, and the small frustrations had been replaced with attentiveness, care, and a quiet sense of accountability. Every passenger had been affected, often without realizing why. And the crew had learned a lesson in awareness, empathy, and responsibility that would stay with them long after the flight ended. As the plane touched down smoothly, the man in seat 18A stood calmly, gathering his belongings. He looked around one last time, noticing the small smiles, the polite nods, and the sense of relief and satisfaction in the cabin. Every interaction, every subtle change, every moment of attention had contributed to this outcome. And he knew that the quiet authority, calm observation, and focus on human behavior had made it possible. Passengers filed out, some unaware of the transformation that had taken place, others quietly reflecting on the improved service and care they had experienced. The crew, now fully aware of the weight of their actions, moved with professionalism and attention, understanding the impact of even the smallest gestures. The man walked through the aisle, leaving the plane not with fanfare, but with quiet satisfaction. He had refused first class, observed the realities of human behavior, and inspired change without raising his voice or creating drama. The ordinary flight had become extraordinary, not because of luxury or power, but because of awareness, empathy, and accountability. And as he stepped off the plane, the story of that flight, its small moments, its subtle transformations, and the quiet power of observation, would remain with those who had experienced it. Passengers and crew alike had witnessed a demonstration of leadership that was invisible yet unmistakable, ordinary yet extraordinary, quiet yet profoundly effective. The man had shown that real influence does not come from authority or status, but from presence, observation, and the courage to act thoughtfully. He had shown that small actions, when guided by awareness and empathy, could ripple outward and change an entire environment. And in that quiet, ordinary moment, he had made a lasting impact on every person in that cabin. A lesson in human behavior, responsibility, and care had been delivered, not with anger, not with drama, but with quiet authority and understanding. The flight ended, but the story lived on in the passengers' reflections, in the crew's changed behavior, and in the memory of the man in seat 18A, who had quietly transformed an ordinary day into a lesson in leadership, empathy, and the extraordinary power of small, thoughtful actions.